Good evening. I'm Jim Reardon Anderson. I'm the Dean of the School of Foreign Service in Qatar. Delighted to be here, and especially delighted to introduce one of our students who's going to introduce this evening's speaker. This is a part of a series that's been going on at Georgetown for 20 years, in which we invite the incoming freshmen to read a novel and then invite the author to come and meet with the students, which this author did today at noon. So she's already had one round with the students, and one of the students in those discussions was Lena Nureldin, who is going to introduce our author this evening. Lena is originally from Sudan, but has been in Qatar for 10 years and just graduated from the English school here. I don't know Lena very well. I don't know any of the freshmen really well. I've only seen them a couple times, but for some reason I've run into Lena now 3 times, and I don't know quite what it is, but she always seems to keep popping up on my register. Since I don't know her, I can't say very much about her, but I'll read what somebody else has said about her. This is what was said about her when she applied to Georgetown. She is hardworking, determined, outgoing, and someone with a clear vision of what she wants to do in the future. So it can't get much better than that. That's what one of her teachers said about her, who apparently did know her fairly well. Lena's plans are to go on and study law and then human rights and perhaps work for the United Nations. She was the president of the Model UN organization in her high school, and I believe joined the Georgetown Model UN here last spring. So she's someone we attracted into our realm, and we're delighted to have her here as a member of the incoming class. So Lena, would you like to introduce this evening's speaker? Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Reardon Anderson. The Hired Man might be Aminatta Forna's 5th book, but it is the complete opposite of the words aging and deteriorating in every way. For a great female author, born in Scotland and raised in Sierra Leone, she was able to capture the essence of people from different places, different background, and even a different gender. Ms. Forna has spent parts of her childhood in Zambia, Iran, and Thailand, as well as Britain and Sierra Leone, which might explain her empathetic abilities to connect with various different cultures. Labeled by London Evening Standards as arguably the best writer fiction in this field of war and its aftermath, she has written 5 books, including The Hired Man, The Memory of Love, and The Devil That Danced on Water, and is a fellow of the Royal Society for Literature, as well as a member of the Folio Academy. Ms. Forna is currently, and thankfully, a Lannan Visiting Chair of Poetics at Georgetown University, so Koya Saksa, and Professor of Creative Writing at Bath Spa University. Awards given to her works include, but go way beyond, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best Book Award, Barnes & Noble's 2013 Critics' Choice, Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Debut Fiction, the Liberator Prize in Germany, and many more. Now, as a freshman in Georgetown here, I initially felt a very odd connection to Duro, the main character in the book, because just like Duro was stepping into new experiences and the sudden change, so was I. Throughout the book, that feeling of connection with Duro never faded. It merely changed the basis on what the connection was felt. Although I have never personally dealt with war and its aftermath, the writing of the book, I thought, was so very powerful and including. I felt every event as if I was there myself. At times where Duro was feeling shocked or confused and not be reading, my cousin would walk by and be like, "Why is your face like that? Calm down, it's just a book." I honestly cannot think of a better book for first-year students. It was very simple, intriguing, and meaningful. Now, please welcome Ms. Donna Hansen, Director of the Library, in conversation with Aminatta Forna. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the Georgetown Library Literary Event of the Year. We like to think it's the best one in Doha, so You'll be our judge at the end of the evening. Now, yesterday, I had the pleasure of spending some time with Aminatta Forna. And fortunately, because she has spent part of her life in Sierra Leone, she did extremely well with the heat and the humidity as we went to Musharraf, to the Qatar, to the souk. She was a real trooper. So it was a pleasure to show you around Doha and to get to know you a little bit better. Tonight we're going to sit in the AC and relax, and I'm going to share her with you. Yesterday I had her to myself, but today it's your turn. So the format for this evening is Aminata and I will have a bit of a conversation. She'll do some readings for us. We'll have a question and answer period at the end, and then following that there is a reception in the library. There's also book signing opportunity at the end as well. So I hope you enjoy our evening. There are a number of people in the audience who may not have had an opportunity to read the book yet. Could you give us a little bit of information, a little summary of it, just a taste, don't tell the ending, to set the tone for our discussion?
Well, thank you very much, first of all. I'm delighted to be here, and that lovely introduction, thank you. And I was reminded, listening to you, actually that my relationship with war, conflict and its aftermath goes further back than just the fact that my family, my father, come from Sierra Leone, where I was raised largely as a child, and of course endured its own terrible civil war between 1991 and 2002. Before that, and you'll remember from my biography perhaps, that I also spent parts of my childhood in Iran and in Thailand. And the reason for that was that my stepfather was a United Nations conflict negotiator. He was a representative in Iran, and I lived there in 1979, which those of you who are old enough to remember that will recall was a crucial year in the history. So as a young person, I witnessed the prelude and duration and aftermath of the Iranian Revolution. And then after that, we moved to Thailand, where my stepfather was dealing with the aftermath of the Cambodian crisis. So actually, I had quite a strong background. These things, they just sort of diffuse to a human being, and that's how we come to do the things we do, work for the UN, become a human rights negotiator or a lawyer. I studied law, actually, first. So we all, our area of interest may be expressed in different ways, but we find it in the end. So The Hired Man is about the prelude and aftermath to a conflict. In this case, it's the Croatian Civil War, the dismemberment of the former Yugoslavia. And the story concerns a woman called Laura, an English woman, and she buys a holiday home in Croatia. And she moves there with the idea of flipping it. And she's going to do it up and she's going to sell it and she's going to make some money. And she takes with her her teenage son and daughter. And when she arrives, she meets a man called Duro. And Duro is a villager. Duro, in fact, finds Laura in a way, but Laura thinks she's found Duro. Duro is a handyman. He needs work, and he offers his assistance to Laura, first of all in doing up the house, but then in generally being a friend and a reliable source of help and information about not just the house, but the environs as well. Laura does not know or suspect that Duro has a long relationship with this house and that he knows the people who used to live there and that the house for him holds certain memories which, as the book continues, Duro finds harder and harder to suppress.
Thanks. So I'm sure there are people in this audience who are from countries where there has been conflict or there is currently conflict, so the themes throughout this book will certainly resonate with this crowd. Now, your previous books were set in Sierra Leone. This one is set in Croatia. So why did you put your characters into this particular conflict instead of another one?
Well, I mean, well said, really, because we write about people, not places. But then we write about people, but then we look for, or I do, look for the theatre to put them in. So when a writer writes, what we're doing is, well, one of the things we might be doing is, it's like writing a play. You want your characters, you want the background, the dialogue. I was drawn to Croatia, and I actually chose it for specific intellectual reasons that for which I was drawn to it. The first was that Croatia, the war in Croatia and the war in Sierra Leone were almost entirely, they took place at exactly the same time. right? Croatia, 1991 to 1995, Sierra Leone, 1991 to 2002. The rest of the war in Yugoslavia goes on longer. Croatia's is resolved by 1995. Not the aftermath, of course, but the conflict. The second thing was, I had friends from Croatia and Bosnia, and we had talked quite a lot about our shared experience of civil war. I had set 3 books in Sierra Leone, a memoir and 2 novels, and I'd looked at the conflict in different ways, non-fiction, fiction. I'd reversed roles. I'd looked at what happened to women. I'd looked at what happened to people who were players or who decided that they were not going to act. And I felt really that I wanted to set my story somewhere else. I was drawn to Croatia for the similarities. As I said, the timeline, the countries are quite similar, almost identical size population, almost identical square mileage, both extremely beautiful coastal cultures. You wouldn't be able to tell it from the footage that you saw during the war, but both of them are extremely beautiful. Agricultural economies, and both of them had suffered 30 years of dictatorship followed by an economic downfall. So in a way I was beginning to learn that there was a blueprint for civil conflict, and certainly economic downfall and political suppression are 2 of the things that come into play. Then there were differences, and I was as interested in the differences as the similarities. It seemed to me that the war in Yugoslavia had kicked off very, very fast, whereas Sierra Leone had been a real slow burn. That was one of the things. And the second thing was that, and we can talk about this later, I'll hold it off, was that one country had reconciled, Sierra Leone had reconciled very well, and yet in the former Yugoslavia, all attempts at reconciliation had pretty much fallen on fallow ground. So I was interested in exploring both the differences and the similarities of those 2 conflicts.
Was it easier to write or more difficult to write about a conflict that you're not personally connected with?
Well, you see, it's a different kind of book. In this book, I had to be both Laura and Duro, right? So in Sierra Leone, I know what happened there, and I know who the players were, and I know when there's an elephant in the room. One of the things that's come up several times today is in these small communities where a civil conflict has happened, or small and large communities, but at village level, you end up living side by side with the people who may have done terrible things to your family, or indeed, if you're a perpetrator, people who you have committed violent acts against them or their family at some other point. So, and yet the people remain together at the end of the conflict. So I knew Sierra Leone, I knew how to read Sierra Leone, right? I knew when there was an elephant in the room. I have been in the room with people who have done terrible things to my family. Yet a visitor to Sierra Leone, and this happened over and over again, a visitor to Sierra Leone doesn't know when that has happened. So here's an example. After the conflict in Sierra Leone, a lot of the demobilized rebel fighters, who, as you probably know, had committed the most awful of atrocities, they were offered various ways to retrain and to try to give them some sort of some kind of job or skill afterwards that they could use. And a lot of them, they could train to be electricians, they could train to be craftsmen, wood craftsmen, and they were also offered the opportunity to get a driving license and become lorry drivers or whatever. And a lot of them took up this option, it being the simplest. They wanted to drive. They liked the idea. And in fact, an awful lot became taxi drivers. So there was a period in Freetown where I didn't catch taxis for this reason, that if you stepped into a taxi, the likelihood that the person driving you, that the man driving you, had committed atrocities at some point in the last 5 years, had murdered villagers, women, children, had set fire and burned people alive in their houses, was quite high. Now, if you were a visitor to that city, you would never know that. So I had to be both Laura and I had to be Duro, the person who knew and the person who didn't know. And so what I did was I made Duro a handyman in much the same way as the person innocently gets into the car. The visitor innocently gets into the car with the taxi driver and knows nothing about the taxi driver's history. I thought, who else is there that you automatically give your trust to? Who do you open the door? Somebody knocks on the door. Who do you just open up and let into your house? You let in the electrician, you let in the plumber, you let in the builder, you let in all the workmen. So I made Duro a workman, I made him a handyman. So in that sense, the story lent itself. There's no more easy or more difficult, but the story lent itself because the first time I visited Croatia, I was really being Laura. I couldn't read this country. Then I went away, I did my research, my friends helped me, and then I came back and I saw the country with completely different eyes, and I could read it at a different level, of course, not the level that a native, a local would, but certainly at a very different level from the one I had a year previously.
Well, it's a rare pleasure to read a book and then have an opportunity to hear the author read it. Would you oblige and read a part of your book for us?
So let me just give you a little bit of where we are. Duro has introduced himself to Laura. He needs the work. He's making himself indispensable. And Laura's husband has been delayed. He's not come back. He's not come to the house yet. So she's on her own, and she's quite reliant on Duro. She needs to go into town to get some bread, and he's offered to take her to the bakery, and at the same time decides they may as well get some things that they need to work on the house. The Blue House. I wonder if anyone but me called it that. To most people, it was the Pavich House, the first Pavich House, because later they moved to a house in town. I circled it with a critical eye, ticked the jobs off on my fingers: gutters, roof, paintwork. The woodwork of the windows was in a poor state. The stonework needed whitewashing. The building was in reasonable structural shape. The dead tree, of course, it needed to be taken down, and then there was everything to be done inside, starting with the wall of the front room. I took a trowel to a windowsill where the wood was soft and splintered. I checked another and found it sound. I went back inside and said to Laura, "We need to get some tiles, wood filler and paint, a blowtorch." She blinked. I added, "For the windows, the wood is rotten. A few more winters and you'll have to replace them all." I turned and addressed myself to the boy who was eating at the table. This is Laura's son. "Duro, pleased to meet you." I put my hand out. Laura covered her mouth. "I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce you." The boy looked up and, seeing my hand, offered his own, though his grip lacked any kind of enthusiasm. "Hi," he said, withdrew his hand and dropped his gaze back to his bowl. We drove into town in Laura's car. Outside the bakery was a queue, the latecomers getting in before lunchtime closing. You need to come into town early for the best bread," I told Laura. She craned her neck to see beyond the line of people. "There's hardly anything left," she said. "Let's go to another shop." "This is the only one." She looked at me and laughed. "Really? Somebody needs to open another one. They'd make a fortune." There used to be another one. Don't tell me it closed for lack of business. The people went away. She glanced at me and shrugged. "Oh, well, nothing to do but wait. I expect you have things you need to do." In the Zodiac, I drank an espresso, no Fabian. After 15 minutes, I returned to the bakery where I found Laura at the counter, talking loudly and pointing with fluttering hands. The woman behind the counter faced her squarely, blankly, refusing to join in the game of sign language. I stepped past the waiting people. "Duro, thank goodness. What would you like?" "I'd like a loaf of bread. Can you ask if there's any wholemeal?" I doubted there would be such a thing, but I translated anyway. The woman, who'd been married to a cousin of mine for a while, replied in Crow, "No." "No," I repeated, "there's only white bread." "Can I order some wholemeal for tomorrow?" I translated, "What do you think?" replied my cousin's ex-wife, again in Crow, which of course was all she spoke. "She apologizes," I said to Laura. "Unfortunately, they're too busy to take special orders. You can only have what's here. As you see, they have a lot of customers." "Oh, well, I'll take one of those." Laura pointed a large loaf and the woman put it into a bag. what's in those pastries? Is it jam or chocolate? Gold coins, replied the woman. She pointed to the 3 types of pastry. Gold coins in here, lost treasure in here, the last one's chocolate. We ran out of treasure. Somebody behind tittered. Custard, I told Laura, like a sort of creme patisserie, not so good. The last one is chocolate, they're the best. Then I'll have 3 chocolate. What would you like, Duro? Have one on me. Thank you. I gave the order. Lucky you, said the ex-wife. She raised an eyebrow. I ignored her. How much? Laura asked, glancing between me and the woman. 800 kuna. Laura turned to me and shook her head slightly. Sorry, what did she say? 8 kuna, I said, and helped her with the coins. We were back in the car. Laura apologized. Thanks, Duro. I don't think she was being very friendly. It's just her way. I thought I'd offended her. I said, she's an angry person. Her husband left her.
Thank you. I love the 800 price for
Yes.
8.
She's
The typical,
being very bitter.
get that annoying tourist. So you've introduced some of the characters in the book. And in the student discussions earlier this week, there was a lot of discussion about characters. And there was some consensus. Laura, the mother, and Matthew, the son, were not favorites. Grace, who was the daughter, was very well liked by the crowd. But Duro had sort of mixed reviews. So there was discussions on, even in the very beginning, you see where Duro is sort of protecting her, cushioning her from what is happening behind the scenes or underneath. There was some discussion, is that his strength that he's doing that for her? Is that a weakness that he's doing that for her? How did you intend him to be that way?
Well, or who's he doing it for? I intended that ambiguity. So I set Duro up as a character. Duro needs the work, and he needs to have Laura on his side. And Laura is a woman on her own in a Croatian village. So he does quite a lot he invests quite a lot in their relationship. He makes himself indispensable. And the tension that I was aiming for is that the reader never knows on whose behalf Duro is actually operating, whether it is, in fact, Laura and her family, or himself, or something else, indeed. So, there's people talk about the unreliable narrator. My belief is that as soon as you write in the first person, your narrator becomes unreliable, because nobody knows themselves that well. And Duro is suppressing an enormous amount. He has been living with things, and he is suppressing an enormous amount. So, to me, it's not even clear if Duro knows all, the multiple motivations for his behavior.
That's a nice insight, that he's not even sure which side he's
Are
on.
we ever? Are we ever, really?
Right. Now, I'm not sure if you said this or if somebody said it of you, that you use literature as a way of asking moral questions.
Oh, well, it sounds like something somebody said about me, but it echoes a thought that I often share with my students. I teach creative writing. I never studied creative writing. I kind of came up in the old school where, you just locked yourself away in a room for 3 years and tried to come up with a novel. But now I teach creative writing. And one of the favorite things that you hear as a student of creative writing is write about what you know. Mm-hmm. Right, write about what you know. And there's a sound reason for that. It's easier. But I tell my students, don't so much write about what you know, write about what you want to understand. And that is what has always motivated me in my writing. Every book has started with a question, right? The Devil that Danced on the Water, how does a country implode? Which I would say is the overarching question in all of my books, how does a country implode? But then it comes down to specifics, ancestor stones. How are our ordinary lives, those of us who just do regular jobs, how are our ordinary lives affected by big P politics in ways that we may not even know? So I took 4 daughters who of the same father, different mothers, spread them out over 3 decades, and looked at how their lives were affected by the bigger picture in their country in ways that they didn't even know or understand. With the memory of love, I was asking the question. One of the things I'm really fascinated by is the whole, that chaos theory. The butterfly flaps its wings somewhere over the continent in South America, and a hurricane happens in China. So I've always been interested in those myriad acts committed by all of us in a society, which take a society to a certain place. And in the memory of love, it was about that. What are the acts of commission or omission that we are all responsible for? And when does inaction become complicity? With the hired man, it was very much, how do you get neighbor to turn on neighbor? Right? How does that happen? People live side by side for decades, and then neighbors turn on neighbors. And I wondered really, how does that happen? It had happened to a certain extent in Sierra Leone, but it was slightly different there. There was an invasion from Liberia. There was a force that swept through the country. People certainly took part in villages and were, and became actors in it. But what happened in Croatia was something really different. It was neighbors turning on neighbors over and over again, in village after village after village, in Croatia, Bosnia, throughout that region.
Well, you have a wonderful passage that you've chosen that really highlights what we're talking about. If you could read that, and then we'll delve a little bit more into human behavior in conflict.
So Gost, the town in which Duro lives, has been bombarded by the Yugoslav army, which was largely Serb and Milosevic controlled, and then that army has been forced back by local, the Croatian, newly formed Croatian National Army, and people of one ethnicity have left, and there's been an ebb and flow of people. Some people start to return to Gost, others leave. Javor's mother makes the journey north to have her operation. Javor puts her on the bus, which is packed with people. The family who owned the baker's shop up sticks and are gone. The shop is closed. The hatch through which they used to sell devrek and the meat pies is sealed. Yesterday's bread still sits on the shelves at the back. Soon it is no longer yesterday's bread, but 3-day-old bread, last week's bread. There's no explanation, no note on the door, just an old notice in faded black felt tip stuck to the door, which asks customers to make their orders for the next day by 10 o'clock. Somebody crosses out the word chleb and writes kru. Both of the words mean bread, but some people use one and some the other. The ones who start leaving are the chlebs. So now there's only one baker's shop in town. This inconveniences everybody, and yet it's also the way we want it. In the closed shop, the bread behind the counter turns blue. I know the family, everyone does, the 2 daughters, the Mongol, the boys at school used to follow and grunt at, and the slutty one in the Angora sweater. I'd often been to their house. My father and theirs were always lending and borrowing things. Also, the father used to supervise karate practice at the sports club, which I went to for a short while because my father thought it would do me good. In their front room, they had a round rug, deep red colors with a Persian-style pattern. I remember it well because I used to sit and stare at my feet and the pattern, embarrassed by the presence of the Mongol, while the red-haired mother offered me day-old pastries from the shop, and the father went to search for whatever he was returning or giving. So when I see a woman and a man, whom I also know, walking down the road with the very same rug on their shoulders, I know exactly from where it has come. The man strides forward and nods briskly at me but doesn't speak and looks me right in the eye for a beat longer than anyone would normally. Behind him, the woman, his wife, who's still wearing her slippers, they're the kind with the small heel, totters under the weight of the thing. She gives me a sheepish grin, lowers her head and scuttles on. The husband's boldness stays with me for a long time. a pair of middle-aged thieves challenging me to challenge them. The door of the family's house stands open. A downstairs window has been broken. The television has gone already, and of course the rug. Over the weeks that follow, the remainder of the family's belongings disappear into the homes of neighbours and former friends. I recognise their curtains hanging in the window of the deputy karate coach's house 2 streets away. Somebody drags a mattress from one of the upper floors, gives up and abandons it in the doorway. Someone else sets fire to it. A sticky little turd appears upon the scorched ticking. Stray cats move in and take over from the family's pet. The Toms make mincemeat of him.
It is morbidly fascinating how people can turn so quickly. Now, you teach a course that's on witness literature. You write about war and conflict. How evil do you think we can be, and is it in all of us?
I've always been really fascinated by that question and the way that the question is usually reversed with a different kind of audience. It was one of the things that made me want to write The Hard Man. Was in Britain, after I had written The Devil That Danced on the Water, Ancestor Stones and The Memory of Love, journalists from countries that had never experienced war, not war correspondents, because they'd seen quite a lot, but journalists, arts journalists, literature critics, would say to me, well, for those of us who are ordinarily good, how does... And I said, hang on a minute, where are we starting with this assumption of ordinarily good?
How does the other?
Yeah, where are we even starting with this? And it was quite interesting that they othered and decided, well, Sierra Leoneans can do that. Well, that's the Croats and that's the Bosnians and that, but this isn't, we here in Britain are ordinarily good. And I thought, no, we're not. We are ordinarily untested, right? We haven't yet been tested, but that doesn't mean that we're ordinarily good. I think the individual capacity for evil is fairly limitless. And I think one of the things that I strive to do so very hard with literature is to get people to walk the walk before they ever have to. So by the end of it, particularly with The Memory of Love, but also with The Hard Man, you have to decide who you would be, right? Would you be those thieves? Would you be Duro? Would you be, one of the people who begin to commit atrocities? Where would you stand? Because it's a slippery moral slope. And what happened in Croatia, which there were many accounts later on afterwards of people talking about the way their family home was robbed. They were after they had left, and it was people they knew who had done it. But what really happened, and I relied a lot on an investigative newspaper called Feral, which is sadly now defunct. But Feral, after the war and during the war, the reporters really risked their lives to uncover these things. And they talked about a particular... I read many, many articles which had become available online about what had happened in particular towns. And they had all followed a very similar trajectory. So you had a group of people who all lived together but had a different ethnicity, Serb and Croat. And what happened was that the Yugoslav army went in and repelled the Croatian National Army repelled the Yugoslav army, which was largely Serb. Right. So the big front of the war was over. Right. That was a pushback. And life went back to normal after a period maybe of months of shelling. Life went back to normal and people managed to sort of continue. But then what happened was militias were sent into each different town and village. And those militias they committed the first atrocities, disappeared people. Right, put them on buses, took them to the woods, killed them. Some people in the town knew what was going on. Other people in the town did not know what was going on. But the big atrocities were committed by outsiders. What then happens is the people become complicit by doing things like stealing from the houses. So, it was engineered in a way, that complicity of the local population. So once people have committed a small crime, what they do is they don't confront the larger crimes because they've already become part of it. So when those militias, when the disappearances become more numerous, and they also become more brazen. And the atrocities are beginning to come to light, that people are not simply being moved somewhere else, they are actually being tortured and killed. The population has already put itself in a position where individuals feel that they cannot stand up because they've already become part of it. Mm-hmm. It's orchestrated. I mean, the one thing I've really discovered about writing about conflict, and civil conflict in particular, is the extent to which this is orchestrated. I'll give you another example, if I may. I'll give you two. Milosevic, his militias, where did he get them from? Football hooligans. He went to the fan clubs and he asked the presidents of the fan clubs, and Serbia had a bad reputation for football hooliganism, he asked them to form militias, and that's who those militias were that went in and did many of the things that you've seen and read about. In Sierra Leone, the atrocities looked so, I remember one of the things that always frustrated me about the way our war in Sierra Leone was reported compared to the former Yugoslavia. The foreign correspondents for the former Yugoslavia gave every single account. The Bosnian Serbs, the Serb Croats, the Muslim Bosnians, the Chetniks, they gave the whole background. When it came, of course, to an African conflict, we went to the usual go-to, here they go again, Africans killing each other. The Sierra Leonean conflict was every bit as foreseen and every bit as complicated. And it worked in a very similar way. The atrocities in the former in Sierra Leone were all committed by a particular unit of the RUF. And do you know what their name was? No. The Civilian Sensitization Unit. And they went into villages and towns before the fighting forces came, and they did the most heinous things, right, to people. You know what they are, I don't have to tell you what they are. They did the most terrible things publicly. They dragged people to the square, and they did the most terrible things to them publicly. The reason they did this is twofold. Just as in the former Yugoslavia, you cow a population, people become terrified, right? But the second thing was that the Sierra Leonean army was not well armed. They had a few AK-47s, and that was it. They didn't have much in the way of armaments. So they didn't want to get into a fight. By the time the Civilian Sensitization Unit had gone into a town, the population was far too cowed to offer any kind of fighting resistance, any kind at all. So all of these things, someone plans it, someone thinks about it, and someone executes it. It isn't as random as it looks.
Not exactly uplifting.
I'm sorry.
Now, in the book, just as Duro was kind of, who is he serving, who is he helping, you left it fairly ambiguous. In our discussions, the theme of ethnic cleansing and the Serbs and the Croats didn't come up. It wasn't. No. It was handled very subtly. So, what was the reason behind having it very subtle, as opposed to putting it up front?
I never say who they are, because I think that it was so important that we looked at individuals and characters and not labels. Every account I read of the former Yugoslavia from before was that people did live side by side with each other. There was a huge amount of intermarriage. So all of these labels were rather meaningless. You might have a Croat woman married to a Serbian man over and over again, and people were just forced to choose their label. I've lived with labels, Sierra Leonean, Scottish, or not, one or the other. People can never quite decide which one I am. But if it comes to a war, someone's going to decide that for me. So I was very keen to take that away, because so much of the conflict had already been described in terms that I didn't think were very useful for understanding what people actually do in war.
Personal parts.
Yeah. And I think so much of, when you get to this kind of conflict, I don't think it's really about this person's a Serb, or this person's a Muslim, or this person's a Croat. I think so much of it, when it's neighbour to neighbour, is about what's gone before, what the history of that town is, what the history of the relationship of those two people is. Krešimir, no, I can't give that away, sorry, you haven't read it. Someone doesn't do something because something or another.
And in the end, it is a personal decision, not a national ethnic decision. It is your own personal one. Now, there are three characters in the book: Duro, which we've heard about, Fabian, and Krešimir, who were all friends growing up. all did terrible things. So the elephant is in the room. Why do you think they all stay knowing all of these things about each other? Why aren't they going off somewhere else?
Well, I do
Escaping.
reveal why they don't go away towards the end of the book, but I can, without giving away too much of it. I mean, most people don't leave. I think that's the first thing to remember, that from an international perspective, when we see a lot of refugees leaving country X, Y, or Z, it's tempting to think that the country's more or less emptied out and everybody to do with the conflict is somewhere else. But actually, in most places, 90% of the people stay there. And people stay with what they have and find it, I won't say they find it easier to adapt, but they do adapt to the situation rather than change their entire lives and go somewhere else. They choose to adapt to the situation. So I think most of us, that's exactly what Sierra Leone's like. Most people are simply still there, right? And they're usually still in the same village or the same town. They don't all move around. They've got ties, they've got land, they've got family, they've got memories. The good memories very often outweigh the bad memories. It's not all about what happened in the last few years. So for Duro, he's got all of that. This is his home, this is where he grew up. He has his little house that he built. And he doesn't want to go anywhere else. For Fabienne did well out of the war, right? Fabienne built up businesses out of the war. So if Fabienne left, he might have to leave those behind. He's got a reason to stay. And no one as long as everyone's keeping quiet, no one's telling any stories, any tales. Now, the relationship between the three men, the controlling factor is Duro. And one of the reasons Duro stays, and this is why I don't want to go away too much, you'll have to stop me. One of the reasons Duro stays is that it is the only way he can think of. He has something on these guys, and it is the only way he can think of exacting his own form of justice. Let me put it like that. It's the only justice Duro can get is to stay and make everybody else stay too.
And they all have to rush out and read what the justice is he's trying to do.